National Catholic Register. This is Register Radio, bringing light and clarity to the news and topics that affect your life.
In a political earthquake in North America, Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada for the last 9 years, has announced his resignation. What exactly is his rather grim record when it comes to Catholics, and what lies ahead for Canada? This week on Register Radio, we're joined by Register senior writer Peter Laffin. And then, a new Archbishop for Washington, D.C. arrives. Register staff reporter Matt McDonald gives us the details on the appointment of Cardinal Robert McElroy as the 8th Archbishop of the nation's capital, as well as an important story that he wrote called Bringing Jubilee Hope Behind Bars. Prison ministers provide life-changing works of mercy. Hi, I'm Matthew Bunson, filling in for Jeanette DeMello, host of Register Radio this week, who's away. I'm joined here in Washington in our D.C. studio by Shannon Mullen, editor-in-chief of the National Catholic Register.
Hello, Matthew.
Hi, Shannon. Always good to have you in studio, the weather permitting, of course.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, now that we can actually be in studio together. Well, as many of the political pundits have observed this last week, Justin Trudeau has announced his resignation. We're still a little hazy as to what that means and what the timing is going to look like, but this is a pretty significant sea change for Canada, isn't it?
Yeah, really, I guess the theme for our show today is leadership change, right? In part, we're not the only country that's going through a major transition. Canada's really grabbed a lot of headlines with Trudeau's resignation, and it's a good time to kind of remind ourselves what's going on up there.
Right, up there, because there's a lot to remind us, especially as Catholics. Peter Laffin, who is, of course, our senior reporter, senior correspondent for the National Catholic Register, has been following this Canadian story. So, Peter, let's bring you in here. What exactly has brought about the resignation of Justin Trudeau?
Hi, Matthew and Shannon. So good to be with you both. I think it's important to touch on the points that Shannon was just making, understanding the Trudeau resignation, not just as a Canada story, but an international story. There's a real vibe shift that's happening across the Western Hemisphere. Voters in the developed nations are rejecting the neoliberal order. Politicians in the Barack Obama mold who champion things like open borders, climate change policy, and really above all, multiculturalism. This idea that there is nothing, you can think it comes from the saying, being on the right side of history, where everything is about this quote-unquote progress. And that's been rejected, and it's been rejected in Canada specifically because it's led to economic troubles. Canada has a very high unemployment rate right now, and also those types of leaders tended to have very harsh COVID policies against which there was just a backlash. And so we're seeing that in a number of countries across the West, not just Canada. So it's important to see it as part of a larger movement.
Yeah, Trudeau, of course, comes from a very famous political dynasty in Canada, and yet he seemed to have missed some, at least, of the efforts at political moderation that exemplified his father's time as prime minister. He's been mocked all over the world for his woke habits, I suppose we could say. But what is exactly his very long and very radical progressive track record? I mean, what are some of the highlights and lowlights?
Yeah, I want to apologize to our listeners now. I'm going to try and play it as straight as possible. As a Catholic journalist, it's hard to find something really redeemable to say about this person. We always want to be as charitable as possible. But he was not only incredibly progressive and thus anti-Catholic in a lot of ways, he was also incredibly insufferable with a lot of his how he presented himself to the public. We remember there was the mass graves narrative that was reported in Canada a couple of years ago. There had been supposedly a discovery of hundreds of bodies of Indigenous children that were supposedly, killed there, put there in a mass grave by Catholic schools. That was the implication, at least. And instead of getting to the bottom of this story, what was Trudeau's immediate reflex? Well, he staged a photo op at a cemetery that had nothing to do with this case, but a cemetery of Indigenous children, and he brought a teddy bear, and he knelt down in front of it, and made himself look really sad. And so this is always his reflex, to take advantage of whatever happens, to make it part of a larger narrative that promotes his progressive goals. It's not just the policies, and we know the policies. He was obviously very radical on euthanasia. Canada is the leader in the culture of death globally. Very radical on abortion, very radical on everything woke. But it was the way he did it that made him sort of extra contemptible.
Yeah, Peter, it wasn't maybe not any one policy mistake that he made, but at the end of the day, he was just so universally disliked.
Yeah.
But you mentioned also, the shift away from a neoliberal kind of world order. Part of that is also censorship, right? So elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere, in the UK, especially Australia, also, you see this real crackdown on free speech. That's fascinating to watch, kind of playing out. But Trudeau was part of that too, correct?
Oh, absolutely. In terms of Trudeau, and in terms of, I think of also Biden, Harris, Obama here in America, it was as much about social coercion and making the opponents of anything they said, seem like the worst people on earth, as much as laws. And what we're seeing in the UK right now is really, I think, speaks to this. For those of you who are listening who aren't familiar with what's happening, Elon Musk has been raising some old stories that were never really adequately covered about child abuse in the UK. And the UK is actively attempting to suppress the story over social media. And we know that, here in America and Canada, during COVID, if you said things online that were against the narrative that they were trying to impose on people, you ran the risk of having your account suspended. Here in America, if you said anything that ended up being true, such as, turns out the COVID lab leak theory wasn't actually debunked. If you said that, for a year in Canada or in America, you were going to have your account taken away. This whole movement, the neoliberal movement, is predicated on the idea that you can control this narrative toward quote unquote progress. And there's been a civilizational backlash against it. Really, these last 2 months, the vibe shift has been unlike anything I've ever seen in politics.
Peter and Matthew, another reason why we're talking about Trudeau is because he's a Catholic, right? Or has a Catholic background.
Yeah. That is the cherry on top, of how we might approach and feel about Justin Trudeau, is that he has called himself a Catholic. He says he's still one. And yet, everything he does is seemingly against the teachings of our church. I had somebody point this out to me after the story got published, after we published the story the other day about Trudeau's anti-Catholic legacy. And somebody in Canada pointed out to me, no, he's not anti-Catholic. What he is he's pro-secular humanistic. He's a pro-secular humanist. And those definitions, they just happen to line up neatly. But Trudeau doesn't approach every issue and say, how can I do the opposite of the Catholic thing? What he wants to do is do the pro-secular humanist thing. And obviously that's led to a disaster morally from our point of view.
Well, and it is something of an irony, too, that we've had two presidents serving, one in the United States and President Joe Biden, and then one in Canada and with Justin Trudeau, who have implemented such radical policies that are so contrary to the teachings of the church. Now, obviously, as secular leaders, upholding the laws and other things are central. But at the same time, one has to ask who exactly was informing them and how are they forming their consciences on some of these major issues.
Absolutely. And, criticism in Canada isn't criticism here. And so it's important to point out when we talk about the Canadian bishops or whoever, whoever in the church up there is taking care of things, they're just a bit more polite than we are. So, it's important to weigh that as we're thinking about the church response. But consider the fact that 1 out of 20 of every death in Canada today is medically assisted suicide. 1 out of 20. And just this year, it was announced that they were having to postpone plans to include in their medical assistance and dying program people who have mental issues. And the reason that they said they were delaying this part of their program is because their health system just wasn't ready for it yet. So it's not like they thought twice and thought, well, maybe it's not a good idea that everybody who has the blues, we can give them government-sanctioned assisted suicide. It was because they don't have enough doctors to see this program through. So the depth of rot, the depth of moral rot is profound, and I think we're going to be untangling it in the months to come.
So obviously there's going to be something of an interim prime minister at some point, but who is likely to succeed him, and what are the prospects in whatever upcoming election? Because you're going to have one sometime this year, right?
If Canada remains a free country, as we know, Donald Trump is using the bully pulpit, and he's made
yes.
he's had a great time calling Canada a state, the 51st state. Governor Trudeau, he's fond of saying. So we'll see how that shakes out. I think he's mostly just trolling on that. But yeah, it is a little hazy just because of the sort of quirks of Canadian politics, the exact mechanics, how this is going to go down. We do know that Trudeau's Labour Party replacement has to be selected by March 24th. So they have to go through a process, his party, over the next few months of settling on a leader. It's very interesting that they are pretty much a leaderless country right now, because when Trump comes into office, he seems like he is totally business with slapping tariffs on Canada, trying to renegotiate maybe a trade deal, and obviously the 51st state talk. It's a really bad time for Canada to not have an executive.
Well, let's just say there is, however, a rising star, or his star has been rising for some time, I know. Who is this as the head of the Conservatives?
Right. Pierre Poilievre. I believe that's how to pronounce the name. I'm doing my best on that one. I was
joking with Shannon earlier that I think it depends on where you're standing, either in the United States or in Canada, so go ahead.
Yeah, I've heard Poilievre, too. I think that one's way off the mark. So I think it's Pierre Poilievre. He's not the most popular politician in Canada, though he's getting a lot of good press right now. His approval ratings aren't that high, but he seems to be the person who's going to be the beneficiary of the Labour Party's collapse. His Conservative Party is way ahead in the polls for their upcoming election later this year. I saw recently they were up by 20 points. Sounds like yesterday he put out a post on X saying that he wanted to take care of Canada first, sort of borrowing the America First slogan that Donald Trump and the MAGA allies have here. So I think we can expect a more nationalistic tone coming out of him, and probably some more common sense economic policies. But again, it's hard to say, because when we think of a nationalist or a Trump type here, you got to think the Canadian version is probably not as strong. They're at least not stylistically as strong as someone like a Trump. But Canada is in for a big change.
Yeah, regardless of what happens. Well, Peter, thanks so much for your reporting, and I know all of us are looking forward to seeing what happens to our northern neighbor, speaking as people who are in the United States right now, so we appreciate it.
Au revoir, Matthew.
Well, stay tuned to Register Radio here on EWTN. When we come back, we're going to talk about bringing Jubilee Hope to prisons and another major change, this time to the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. You're listening to Register Radio. Please don't go anywhere.
Let's return to Register Radio on EWTN.
And welcome back. I'm Matthew Bunson, filling in for Jeanette DeMello this week in the D.C. studio here with Shannon Mullen, who is the editor-in-chief of the National Catholic Register. Well, Pope Francis has made more than a dozen visits to prisons during his pontificate. He's opened a holy door at the chapel of Rebibbia Prison in Rome. He did that the day after Christmas, 2 days after he initiated the Jubilee year of 2025 by opening a holy door at St. Peter's Basilica. He is certainly someone who has been concerned over the years for prisoners. His concern is also certainly part of the corporal works of mercy, of visiting and comforting the sick and the imprisoned. But how can the Jubilee be a time of mercy for those who find themselves in the dire straits of prison? Well, Register staff reporter Matt McDonald took up this question in a new piece, Bringing Jubilee Hope Behind Bars. Prison ministers provide life-changing works of mercy. Matt, what was the most surprising thing to you as you worked on this story?
I would say the universal reaction of people who do prison ministry, which is they were really afraid before they started doing it, and then they fell in love with it, and it became something they couldn't stop doing.
Yeah, so from your standpoint, as you were doing this research, I know that you talked to a lot of different people, and you just mentioned the universal aspect of this, but what were some of the most poignant moments, and what were some of the stories that are really going to stay with you?
The things that really jump out at me, first, the Texas women's death row, where there are 7 women sentenced to death, and all of them lay affiliates of a Catholic religious order. And the way that came about astounds me in a couple of ways. First, the idea that women convicted of murder would try to turn their lives around in this way. But then second, the deacon who is a chaplain there and has seen these women for years thought that what they really needed was interaction with religious sisters. And he contacted a convent of contemplative nuns. So these are nuns that ordinarily don't leave the convent. But he persuaded them that these women really needed them. So they made an exception. And their exception is they visit these women regularly. And as a result of this, 5 of them who were not Catholics became Catholics. And all 7 of them now practice these nuns' religious. They practice their spirituality in some fashion.
Yeah, that's amazing, Matt. You know, I love this story because it reminds Catholics of the 7 corporal works of mercy, right? And feed the hungry, okay? Give drink to the thirsty, all right? Shelter the homeless. You know, plenty of people do that. You get down to the list, though, and you hit visit the prisoners, and that pulls us up short. It's the hardest corporal work of mercy, I think you can say. And you alluded to it in your opener. The people you talked to were initially fearful. So what happens to people who are involved in this ministry? How do they overcome that? How does that transformation take place for them?
It seems to happen quickly. So what I heard from the people I talked to was that they didn't want to do this. They kind of put it off. And several of them, they got involved only when they thought they just couldn't say no. And then when they got in and started speaking to people who are in prison, I should mention that this is, in some ways, these are the cream of the crop because these are people who want to turn their life around. There are a lot of people in prison who don't want to turn their life around. But when they interact with people who do or who are searching for something, searching for God, the connections they make are often not instant, but lasting, particularly if they're with these people for a number of days. In some of these cases, there were as many as 3-day retreats going on, and they felt they made a real connection with them, and it's a soul-to-soul, heart-to-heart kind of thing.
Yeah, it's so commendable, the work that they do, but it also reminds you that we can do these things really only through God's grace, and people who, even just walking into a prison or getting through the security, I mean, it's just so intimidating.
Kind of unimaginable for the average person.
Yeah, and then once you get there, okay, you're in, but it's not like a normal building, and so I'm so glad you did that story.
Thanks. And thanks to these people. Of course, this is very difficult ministry for a number of reasons. The reasons you alluded to, this is not popular ministry. I would say that of the list of corporal works of mercy, this is maybe the least popular one because most people are not very happy with criminals, understandably. People who go to jail have not been convicted of being in a boy band. They've hurt other people very often, and sometimes grievously. And so these are people that a lot of people say, well, look, put them away, throw away the key. And these people have, these people ministering to them have overcome that hurdle and also overcome the hurdle of just going through the background check, hearing the bars, the doors close behind you. That's if you've ever been in prison. I've done this a couple times for a couple stories. It's a horrible sound just to hear the doors close behind you, even though you figure you're going to be leaving pretty soon. So it's as you say, it's an intimidating, it's a difficult ministry, but these people are very into it, and they feel like they're doing God's work.
You've been busy, Matt. So this week came the news of a leadership change in the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. Tell us what's going on there.
So there's a new Archbishop going to be installed March 11th. This is Cardinal Robert McElroy, the Bishop of San Diego, and he's replacing Cardinal Wilton Gregory, who's been there since 2019. And the story isn't so much about Cardinal Gregory or about Cardinal McElroy, but rather the position of Archbishop of Washington and why it's important. And one priest in the diocese told me that a lot of people see it as something that Rome pays a lot of attention to, because even though the Archbishop of Washington is not specifically a diplomat, a lot of people think of the Archbishop of Washington as somehow specially representing the views of Rome.
Yeah, you have a piece at ncregister.com that I encourage everyone to read, and it's basically a profile of the Archdiocese, and the title is D.C. isn't the largest or the oldest U.S. Archdiocese, but it's where the action is. Now, you detail in this piece sort of the history of this, and it had that very interesting historical reality that this is one that was sort of imposed or created, as you put it, top down rather than from bottom up in order to meet some sort of a dire pastoral need, because it was carved out of the Archdiocese of Baltimore. But in a way that speaks to sort of the uniqueness of this Archdiocese, doesn't it?
It does. For many years, there were very few Catholics in Washington. Washington, of course, is an artificial city. It was created to be the capital of the country in an area that didn't have a lot of people to begin with. And it wasn't a very Catholic place. It made sense in the early years of the Republic for it to be part of the first see of the country, the Archdiocese of Baltimore. And for about 150 years, the Archbishops of Baltimore had Washington as part of their archdiocese. And several of them fought the idea of having a separate archdiocese. But Rome wanted a archbishop of the city itself, of the capital city of the country, in a way as a manner of dealing with the federal government. Not formally through diplomatic channels, but the Archbishop of Washington, when he speaks, it's often listened to because they're wondering if they're hearing the Pope speak.
Yeah, Matt, in addition, as you note, it's not only Washington, D.C., it's not only the home of the government, it's also the residence of the Apostolic Nuncio, who's the ambassador of the Holy See in America. So who plays a role in the selection of bishops and ordinaries in the United States. And so it landed on Cardinal McElroy to come to D.C. And as your piece points out, the D.C. Archbishop is, among other things, interrelates with the White House. What do we know about Cardinal McElroy and his views towards the incoming Trump administration?
Cardinal McElroy, as Bishop of San Diego, was a critic of President Trump, particularly with respect to illegal immigration. And that's true of a lot of bishops, but his comments were particularly pointed. And so he's thought of as someone who is likely to resist Trump administration policies on illegal immigration. Of course, it depends on what the actions of the Trump administration are. We know what President-elect Trump has said he's going to do, but he's not in office yet for a second term. So as Cardinal McElroy alluded to during his press conference when he was introduced as Archbishop of Washington, we'll see what the Trump administration does. But Cardinal McElroy also pointed out the likelihood that there would be conflict in that area.
Yeah, in particular on immigration and probably a few other points. It's also worth noting that Cardinal Gregory will be turning 71 in just a couple of weeks. By custom, by tradition, a bishop or Archbishop, submits his resignation when they turn 75. So that's in basically 4 years. So we can say that in many ways his time as Archbishop is going to be, dare one say, coterminous with the second Trump administration, which is perhaps an indicator, too, of some of the things that Pope Francis may have in mind in appointing him.
Yeah, it's very interesting that, as you point out, the timing is such that if he were to retire at age 75, it would be almost exactly the length of the second Trump administration. He would leave shortly after President Trump leaves for his second term. Now, of course, he could be extended until age 80, perhaps. But
which there's a certain custom for that, too. But, yeah, this is all very interesting, isn't it?
Yes.
Well, Matt, thanks so much. I know you have been covering the McElroy appointment and will continue to do so. And I know we all look forward to reading further coverage, especially as the next months and years stretch on. Well, that's it for this week for Register Radio. But remember, for more news, analysis, and commentary, please check out the National Catholic Register online at ncregister.com. Thanks so much for joining us here, especially here on EWTN Radio. Until next week, on behalf of our producer, Michael McCall, myself, Matthew Bunson, and Shannon Mullen, Editor-in-Chief of the National Catholic Register, I pray that God bless you. Please, take care and stay warm.